So I have some field experience with appreciative inquiry, and I want to share one example. And I've done this many times for many different organizations and sometimes even communities, but I think this one example is small enough we can get our hands around it. There is a botanical garden called Tohono Chul Park, and it's in Tucson. And I have been working with them for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years now. And I will never forget the very first time that I went down to Tucson to help them. Their executive director was brand new. And she, like sometimes happens when an executive director is replaced, she came into a situation where there had been some problems. The organization was still operating pretty well, but the morale of her staff was not good. And there were a number of reasons. There always are a number of, like perfect storm reasons. And those reasons were reasons that are common, I think, to a lot of organizations. They had a lot of stuff that they wanted to do, but they didn't have enough people, they didn't have enough money, and they felt like they didn't have the support for living out these aspirations. And on top of that, what happens sometimes when you don't feel like you've got the support you need to move in the right direction is you just kind of, individual program managers or whatever, they hunker down, they do their own thing, they kind of ignore the bigger picture, they focus on what does give them pleasure, because if they focus on the bigger picture, they get frustrated and they feel bad about being there. And so they focus on what they like. And sometimes what they like may or may not be the priorities of the organization. If you have 10 things you need to do, some of them are more urgent than others. But if what you're trying to do is like just hang on in your job and not hate the place so much that you feel like you have to run out the door, then you often will prioritize things that personally enable you as coping mechanism almost to stay there and to keep working. And a lot of that was going on. And because of that, there was no overarching coordination or communication between the program managers. And when they did communicate with each other, it was often over some kind of a clash between the resources one of them needed to do what he or she wanted to do, and the resources that somebody else needed to do what they wanted to do. And so the relationships among the main managers were not that good. And there was a lot of morale problems. So that's kind of the backdrop of why I was brought down. And I thought a lot about what I wanted to do when I got in that room. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, but I have had 400 or 500 hours of mediation and facilitation training, and I am pretty good, if I do say so myself, at handling conflict when it arises. And one of the interesting things about that training is you walk into a situation knowing there might be conflict, but you have no idea what kind of conflict is coming. So the training prepares you for knowing how to move people through conflict and to the other side, even when you don't know what's coming. So I was anticipating conflict, and I didn't really want this to be a psychological, what am I trying to say? That's not right. I didn't want it to be a therapy session. I didn't want it to be like marriage counseling. I wanted them to come out of the situation uplifted and inspired, not by me, but by the amazing work that they are doing already and that they could do, and the possibilities. And I wanted them to believe that it was possible for them to move from this kind of negative space where they were into a kind of a community dream, an inspired dream where they could work together to get to that place. So what I didn't want to do was I didn't want to look backward. I didn't want them to describe all the problems, because I knew that with describing problems was going to be finger pointing. There was going to be a lot of blame. I could have done X. I wanted to do X. X is really important. X is really special. But so-and-so got in my way of X, and so-and-so needs to move out of my way. I did not want that. I knew that was not going to go well. That would just create defensiveness. It would create it would create barriers that we would have to then go back and get over before we could get on to that business. So I decided to start with appreciative inquiry, which does not look back. And there are times when, academics and researchers and just people who are curious want to look at problems and want to peel back the onion of problems and see how we got to this place. But sometimes in an organization that is, or a community that is got politics, internal politics, and highly charged emotions and disappointments, the best way to get to a place where you can look back is to move them forward to a place where they feel good and everything is much better. And then if you want to, you can turn them around and say, look how far we've come. Does anybody feel a need to actually kind of break down some of the problems that were there so that we can avoid them in the future? But sometimes there's not even any point. Once you get to a good place and everything is working, sometimes it's best just to leave well enough alone. All right, so I entered this room full of people I did not know. The executive director is actually somebody I've known for many, many years. We worked together at the Nature Conservancy when I was the public affairs director there, and she was actually the communications director there. And to give her a little more body to what I say about her, so you don't go off thinking that all she knew was communications, even though that's a lot. She also had a PhD in science, so it was a good place for her to be at a botanical garden, and she had actually been at a desert botanical garden that was much larger before. And she also had managed many people and supervised people in departments and so forth, so she was ready for this job. But she wanted some outside help to straighten out this morale problem that she had. And so she had told me a little bit about each of the characters in the room, but I hadn't met them. So I sat down with these people and we went around and, I told them a little bit about myself and my background, and we went around and they introduced themselves and talked about, what their departments did. And when we got done with all that intro stuff, I invited everyone to dream with me, literally to dream forward. I told them that I knew from talking to their boss, Christine, that they were short on money and that they were short on hands on deck, that they could use more staff and they could use more financial resources. And there were probably other things they could use as well. But I asked them to sort of imagine physically taking everything that they thought that was a barrier to their ability to do the best in their department and do the best in their program and to do the best in their job, and just set what they knew about those barriers under the table, to put their lack of staff under the table, to put their lack of money under the table, and just to leave it under the table for a conversation, not about what was possible under the current circumstances, but what ought to be. Every one of them was there because they believed in the cause of Tohono Chul Park. They believed in teaching people to use water better. They believed in teaching people to make edible gardens and to beautify their landscape using plants that were indigenous to the area. They believed in education, and they believed in being outdoors, and they believed in all of the things that come with a botanical garden. And they all shared that. And I actually had them start by going around and saying, what it was that they loved the most about the idea of the botanical garden and working there. And it was through that first question: what is it that that you really love the most? What is it that keeps you here? What experiences in this place keep you passionate about the work that you do? And we were able, everybody, to see how they shared their passion around the things that happen in a botanical garden setting. And that was my first appreciative inquiry question: to talk to me about what is the best about what you do and about the place where you do it. Once we got past that, I asked them to divide up into tiny groups that were just, and this was management staff, so we had usually the head of a program and maybe one or two people who worked on that program with the manager. And I asked them all to break up into the groups, into their program groups. And not to think about what was possible, what they had the resources for, what they had enough people for, but to think about what they ideally dreamed that they could do with their department. How, if they just had all the resources in the world, what would they like to see their program look like? And I asked them to spend a few minutes as program people, talking that through and taking a few notes about what that dream looks like. And again, when we shared out, you could see people smiling and their heads nodding, and you could basically see them seeing the value and the benefit in the best of what could possibly be done in that room. And I'm not going to take you through the whole rest of the story about what happened in that room that day, but I will tell you one story. So one of the people in the room was the person who ran he was the manager, supervisor over all of the gardeners. And they didn't just take care of the plants on the property, they also cultivated indigenous plants that they then later sold at an indigenous plant sale. And that plant sale actually was geared to raise money for their organization. And I'm going to tell you a little story about how just putting your obstacles under the table helps unblock your vision sometimes. So I mentioned that they cultivated indigenous plants and sold them at a fundraiser. And it turns out, I'm skipping a whole bunch of the story, but it turns out that those plants cost about 11 cents a piece to cultivate. But their plant sales had become wildly popular in Tucson, and they had actually begun to hold them twice a year, and they could not begin to cultivate enough plants for the people that wanted them. And so they began to order indigenous plants from other nurseries that had much bigger operations. And what ended up happening was that the plants that they ordered cost them about $3 to $4 a piece, depending on the plants. So the ones that they cultivated cost them 11 cents a piece, and the ones that they purchased cost between $3 and $4. And it was interesting because what was happening is that these fundraisers were basically at a place where they weren't raising any money. And I don't think they were costing any money either, but they were an awful lot of work. They were still mission accomplished because they were still getting indigenous plants out there, but they were not providing resources. And the supervisor that I first started talking about, he had a dream of enlarging his cultivation beds because he knew that if he could cultivate many, many more plants, that they could sell plants that had only cost them 11 cents a piece, and they could buy many fewer of these $3 to $4 plants, and they could raise more money. But he was caught in a chicken and the egg because he didn't have the money to do what was needed to be done, which was to clear some space and build and put in, the plumbing and whatever else that they needed to take care of and water and whatever. And he was going to need some more people too, maybe another person. And he just didn't see it as possible. He was already stretching to get all of their maintenance and cultivation chores done. And it was interesting because I don't think they knew until I got there. Another piece I didn't tell you about was I made them begin cost accounting their projects. A lot of nonprofit organizations, because donations aren't actually tied, like in a business, you know how much it costs to produce a widget, and then you sell it, and you can see the difference between your production costs and your sales costs, and that's your profit. But in nonprofits, a lot of money comes in that's not connected to anything. It's just donations. And many, many nonprofits do what we call revenue accounting. They show how much money is coming in through donations and grants and whatever, and then they show how much money is going out, and those are two separate streams, and they don't ever stop to look and see. When I got there, I asked them before our day, I asked the bookkeeper and Christine, my friend, to please take the time. I told them many months before to cost account their work, because we were going to need that to look at some of the things that they wanted to look at. And so it was only because I asked them to cost account that they realized that these plant sales were not actually making them money. And it turns out that most of their money was being made by a restaurant that they had on site that drew in a lot of people who never even went past the restaurant to the gardens, but it was generating most of their profit. And I think that all the people that worked on cultivating and running the plant show were really pretty miffed to find out that they weren't making money for the organization, and that was very upsetting to them. But we were able to solve all of these problems just by talking about the dream of enlarging the cultivated beds. And nobody really knew that that was what he had wanted to do. He never mentioned it, and the reason he never mentioned it was because they were so short-staffed and so short of funds that it just wasn't not even worth mentioning. When my friend Christine heard what he wanted to do, and when she realized that it was a one-time investment, and it was going to be pretty pricey. It was going to be, I don't know, $40,000 or $50,000 to do the work of excavating a piece of property and setting it all up with everything that it needed to continue to cultivate. But when she realized it was a one-time investment that was going to generate so much money over time for the organization by allowing them to cultivate the majority of the plants that they sold and reducing the number of expensive plants that they had to bring in from other places, she realized that it would be easy for her to go to one of her bigger donors and say, look, we'll name this cultivation bed after your family, and if you do this one-time donation, it won't be a thing we come back to you for every year. If you do this one-time donation, you will be taking care of the Tohono Chul Park for the rest of its life. And so just asking him to put away what he knew about what he could and couldn't do, this idea came up that enabled them to basically move forward and to build another cultivation bed that was much larger, and to reduce their reliance on outside plant nurseries, and to basically earn a lot more money per plant when they sold, and to put the idea back into place, and this time in reality, that those plant sales were actually supporting the organization and all of the work that it did. So there were lots of other things that have been explored when I've asked people not to think about their barriers and their obstacles, but to think about what they dream, and to bring other people in to help think about how to achieve those dreams. And that's just an example. So this is what we are hoping to do. I've already explained in another video why I picked this subject. I'd really like to have the community hope and dream with us about how to make the university a bigger player, a more impactful player, a better partner in solving all of the many community ills that are out there, and getting that knowledge back out in a meaningful and impactful way into the community. And I think rather than asking the researchers and the educators what they want to research and how they see themselves educating, to ask the community, what do we need right now, community? What would be useful? How could we be a best partner to you? And that is your task.